Kia ora tātou, no mai, haere mai. My name is Ian Purdy. I'm the Head of Infrastructure and Property Investment at Accident Compensation Corporation, and I'm also a board member of Infrastructure New Zealand. Welcome to this session addressing building for broader outcomes. Thanks very much to Juliet and all the team at Jacobs for your support of this session. We have an exciting lineup of speakers for you today from around the world. First up is Victoria Johnson. Victoria leads a social value solutions practice within Jacobs, providing expertise in strategic planning, program management, capital improvement planning, and urban economic development in conjunction with a large infrastructure programs nationwide. Victoria was recently appointed to serve on a national industry recovery panel to advise the Biden administration and Congress on federal recovery policies. Victoria is currently advising senior leaders in the Biden administration and Congress on how infrastructure investment can be used to create and deliver enduring social justice through job creation and inclusive economic development. Victoria rates her most interesting career moment as working on the California high-speed rail project. Welcome, Victoria.
Thank you so much, Ian. I very much appreciate the opportunity to share with you today. And I'd like to greet you and say tena kutu katoa. Good day and good health to everyone. It is so excited to be talking with you in New Zealand from here in the United States. My name is Victoria Johnson, and I want to extend a warm thank you to Infrastructure New Zealand for the opportunity to speak with you today. I would also like to acknowledge Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern and the ministers of the New Zealand government that have spoken during the symposium for their wisdom and insight. I hope everyone is staying safe and healthy. It's unfortunate we could not convene in person due to the pandemic, but I certainly look forward to keeping the lines of communication open as we work together as environmental stewards. As Ian shared, I serve as the social value equity practice leader for the Americas at Jacobs, and I serve along with my fellow colleagues on a global leadership team stewarding a growth initiative to operationalize social value and equity throughout Jacobs' global enterprise of 55,000 all over the world. We deliver tens of thousands of solutions across industries in over 40 countries globally, and I am so glad to have the opportunity to speak with you today. Today, I will be discussing a bit about how we build broader outcomes, and really discuss how we can steward more transformative infrastructure and generate broader outcomes through investments in infrastructure through social value techniques across multiple sectors, including transportation, transit, water, aviation, and the built environment, all while reducing our carbon footprint. I would like to start by sharing Jacobs' environmental and social governance priorities and the role social value plays in achieving ESG goals. The climate crisis and systemic inequalities are just two global challenges that must be addressed by businesses and individuals alike in order to preserve both people and the planet. So essentially, in our 80-year history, Jacobs has long been committed to safety, ethics, integrity, and having a positive impact on communities all over the world. And as a purpose-led company, we know we have a pivotal role to play in this transformational moment. Our ESG journey is guided by our global sustainability strategy, Plan Beyond. We recognize that in the face of the many tragedies and disruption of this pandemic, along with a global climate crisis, it's time to double down and level up. Driving environmental and social impact is no longer just the right thing to do, it's also a business imperative. We consider it not only good business, but our duty to channel our expansive capabilities in resilient infrastructure, clean water, green energy, social value, and beyond toward benefiting people and the planet. This will help create long-term success, resilience, and broader outcomes in wider society in which we live. Our Plan Beyond strategy is anchored in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals to clearly demonstrate how we are contributing to delivering sustainable outcomes. All 17 of the Sustainable Development Goals are interconnected, and no progress can be achieved in isolation of any one goal. Based on a robust materiality assessment, including engagement with stakeholders throughout our value chain, we have identified 6 core SDGs that are material to our business, where we can have the most influence and impact. So with that, we remain committed to driving progress against all 17 SDGs. Based on our 6 core SDGs, we have developed 6 sustainable business objectives that sit at the heart of our company strategy. These 6 sustainable business objectives define our aspirations for how we as an organization and individuals can play a part in creating a sustainable future for all. Today, I will expand upon sustainable business objective number 1, advancing the health, well-being, and safety of society to generate broader outcomes through infrastructure. So as we prioritize social impact, it's important that we understand how we define social value, equity, diversity, inclusion, and environmental justice. We hear these terms quite often, but what do they mean? Let's ground ourselves briefly in terminology and define what this means for us and social impact. Social value describes the social impact at the heart of our mission, building safe, resilient, sustainable infrastructure across all sectors. Across the public and private sectors, we have a substantial and lasting impact on society of our work. Through infrastructure, we transform the communities we live and work in. Through environmental justice, economic inclusion, social and racial equity, sustainability, and resilience. Social value is defined by how infrastructure improves the lived experience of individuals and communities across multiple areas, including community well-being, housing affordability, workforce development, access to jobs, and equality. Social value analysis and well-being refers to the total value for society as a whole. It captures how infrastructure programs affect well-being, including measuring and delivering economic, environmental, and wider societal impacts. Social value measurement can be used as an effective tool when it comes to delivering equitable outcomes. It can also be used strategically at the outset from planning and design to essentially inform options, selection, decision-making to ultimately deliver legacy for diverse communities. JEDI is a term that we use often here in the States, which describes this equity, diversity, and inclusion. I will define all 4 terms just briefly. Justice refers to repairing the impact and of injustice and systemic discrimination and bias through public policy, and taking corrective action to repair broken systems and right wrongs through legislation, policies, procurement, guidelines, and initiatives. In our industry, social, racial, environmental justice are common terms here in the States. Diversity refers to the traits and characteristics that make people unique. Having diversity in terms of race, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, religion, or country of origin provides diversity of thought, which makes us better and produces more inclusive outcomes. Inclusion refers to the behaviors and social norms that ensure that people feel welcome and create a culture of belonging. Not only is inclusivity crucial for diversity efforts to succeed, but creating an inclusive culture will prove beneficial for engagement and productivity. At the heart of inclusion is how we engage, include, and acknowledge the communities around us who suffer a disproportionate impact of infrastructure via climate change, storm events, access to broadband, and the location of roads and highways throughout the urban environment. Equity is concerned with the distribution of benefits and burdens of infrastructure projects, plans, and policies. Equity refers to just and fair inclusion. And to do this, we must address systemic inequalities caused by current and historic discriminatory practices and public policies that excluded certain groups through practices such as redlining and urban planning, resulting in a legacy of disproportionate impact on low-income citizens, people of color, Black and Brown communities, Indigenous communities, and First Nations. Why is history relevant today, you ask? Well, as our society becomes more socially conscious, some may ask, What does our history have to do with today? It's in the past. Well, the reality is everyone is impacted by history as we speak. Some of us are reaping the benefits of historic laws and public policy, and others are suffering undue burdens and harm, as well as harsh exclusion from community benefits and well-being. The impact is heavily based on race, gender, location, and income. Environmental justice refers to the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to environmental laws, regulations, and policies. The United States Environmental Protection Agency, better known as, is a federal regulatory agency. Its executive administrators have made environmental justice a top priority, addressing chronic injustice among minority and low-income populations. In order to implement these priorities, a new paradigm of collaboration is essential. Multi-sector partnerships across government, regulatory agencies, the public and private sector, and nonprofit organizations are critical in order to realize broader outcomes. In order to create a more resilient and equitable future, it will take all of us working together to steward equitable, just, and transformational infrastructure. And as you can see here, the impact is tremendous in terms of environmental impact, racial and economic impact, climate action and resilience, which ultimately produces more transformational outcomes. So next, I would like to discuss some of the government priorities in the equity space here in the United States. Government priorities greatly impact the lives of all of us, as we all know. And shortly, I would like to briefly discuss how federal in the US are forming to target more equitable outcomes. So federal and state municipal agencies are in the US are prioritizing equity and integrating it fully into their agencies. The Biden administration has made it clear that equity is a federal priority. The Build Back Better plan and the American Jobs Plan, as well as the Racial Equity Plan, all demonstrate legislative efforts towards equality and justice. On November 15th, President Biden signed the Bipartisan Infrastructure Deal and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. This bill, amounts to $1.2 trillion in spending over 5 years, from transportation to water, aviation, health, and housing. Federal agencies across sectors are prioritizing investment in infrastructure and equity. We are proud to be working with the administration on advancing this legislation and advising on the human impact and opportunity it presents. In the US, we are also seeing historic investment, as I shared, in climate and infrastructure. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Build Back Better plan together account for over $1 trillion of investment in climate and infrastructure. This is a prime opportunity for all of us to do our part in spreading the wealth to underserved communities, job seekers, and diverse suppliers. President Biden's bipartisan infrastructure deal, again, was recently Congress on November the 8th and signed on November the 15th. So this has been a very exciting week here in the States. This is the largest federal infrastructure investment in generations, and it is a critical piece of legislation that will strengthen our nation's resilience to extreme weather and climate change while reducing greenhouse gas emissions, expanding access to clean drinking water, building up on a clean power grid, and much, much more. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act will mean increased spending across multiple sectors. For example, in mass transit, we will see a 57% increase of spending. Amtrak, our national rail system, will see an increase of over 527%, and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency Superfund will see a 58% increase. Combined, this investment will mean increased equity and environmental justice outcomes for communities across the nation. For example, communities that have been historically excluded from infrastructure developments are likely to see greater investments in infrastructure. The administration also aims to repair harm and damage from the United States history of racial discrimination and disparities, and how the government builds, repairs, and locates physical infrastructure. In the 1950s and 60s, highway projects often targeted Black neighborhoods, destroying cultural and economic centers, and bringing decades of environmental harm. State and local officials often steered roads through Black communities, isolating them from parks and economic gain. The Federal Racial Equity and Infrastructure Plan will put more people back to work, school, improve access to health care, broadband, and affordable housing. So racial equity is also a priority in the states at the federal, state, and municipal levels. The Federal Justice 40 Plan seeks to create equitable recovery for Americans facing a myriad of challenges created by aging infrastructure, a frayed social safety net, natural disasters, and the ongoing COVID-19. Justice 40 addresses inequities that hinder a sustainable, just society, and that disproportionately harm low-income and communities of color throughout the U.S. Justice 40 pledges at least 40% of federal infrastructure investments directly to frontline communities most affected by poverty and pollution. So now I'd like to talk a bit more about what this looks like in practice. In the infrastructure sector, equity, justice, social value, and community well-being are becoming increasingly prominent in projects. Let's take a closer look at broader outcomes and action by seeing how social value plays out in projects across sectors. As I move to close, I will share case studies illustrating how public agencies are implementing equity into its operations across transit, water, aviation, the built environment, and solid waste. The New York Department of Environmental Protection Agency is conducting a feasibility study to convert Rikers Island, a long-held corrections facility, into land used for wastewater treatment facilities. If approved, this project will have social value priorities to engage, train, and employ citizens who have been touched by the criminal justice system. In conjunction, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey is also stewarding social justice and equity initiatives through its redevelopment of 3 airports, LaGuardia, JFK, and Newark International Airports. As a part of our $90 million program management contract, we are leading the development and implementation of an agency-wide workforce development program at all 3 airports, targeting immigrants, Black and Brown communities, and re-entry citizens. And through our work, we're ensuring that we're partnering with local community-based organizations on training so that individuals across New York's 5 boroughs will benefit from this investment through jobs. Our social value team is Transportation Coalition, a consortium of 17 states on the Eastern Seaboard, to assess the best way to determine the socioeconomic impact a transportation funding mechanism will have, called mileage-based user fees. In the US, much of our transportation funding comes from fuel tax, which is based on how much fuel a vehicle purchases. As vehicles become more fuel efficient, the funding mechanism is not sustainable, particularly as population growth requires more robust infrastructure. Because of this, many states are exploring mileage-based use as an alternative and wondering how a shift to user fees would impact households. Our team provided an analysis and gave recommendations for best practices to determine the socioeconomic effects of proposed mileage-based user fees. In the water sector, we have over 65,000 water utilities, 50,000 drinking water utilities, and 50,000 wastewater, sewer, and storm utilities. And this slide essentially shows 25 cities from the West Coast, California, Washington, to the Midwest, the South, as well as the East Coast, fully committed to what we call water equity. And in cooperation and partnership, essentially Alliance, we have stewarded a partnership across 25 cities with the goal of getting to 75 cities by 2025 for partnerships with water utilities who are led by the executive leadership in partnership with the private sector and with the local community-based organizations who are working together to address water quality issues, green infrastructure, workforce development issues, and a whole host of issues unique to the water sector, but also doing a lot of peer exchange to other sectors who are also interested in this approach. This slide here highlights the deliverables and outcomes with 7 water equity roadmaps and action plans, as well as the 8th document you see there is essentially an overview of the first cohort of 7 cities, again, which is now up to 25, essentially detailing some of the barriers and challenges that local constituents and ratepayers have and how they plan to work across the aisle to address some of those issues. Strategic planning, capital improvement programs, integrated project delivery, as well as procurement policies that are equity focused are some of these social value and equity solutions that our market is deploying in order to address some of our water equity challenges in the states. So as I move to close, I would like to leave you with a few social value and equity resources. Jacobs to partner with our partner firm in on social value measurement and analysis on our white paper by the name of Before and Beyond the Build. This document offers a blueprint to creating enduring social value through infrastructure investment and remains a guiding document for our social value practice at Jacobs. I would also like to share, and if you're in front of your screens and have your cell phone, please feel free to get a snapshot of those QR codes. Thought leadership with regards to the Biden administration's Build Back Better plan and some of the human, people-centered aspect of the work, as well as some other pieces across sectors, which really discussed from the Brookings Institution, as well as the Global Infrastructure Hub, and we'll hear from Monica shortly, essentially stewarding thought leadership and resources in this space. And with that, I would like to thank you and turn it over to my colleague, Juliet Woodward, who will moderate our panel discussion. Juliet is an executive director of Jacobs New Zealand with over 30 years of engineering, infrastructure, and environmental project management and operational leadership across Australia, New Zealand, the Pacific, and the United Kingdom. Juliet is a strong advocate for driving social value through infrastructure project planning and execution on the Eastern Busway Alliance and the Let's Get Wellington Moving MRT projects. Over to you, Juliet.
Morena, everyone. Thanks, Victoria. That was awesome. I'm super excited this morning to facilitate such an incredibly talented and diverse panel. And I did note with the panelists in Ian this morning, an all-female panel, which is, I think, maybe the first for this infrastructure conference. So well done panelists. So last week, I was very fortunate to sit in on the APEC CEO Summit. And we heard from Jacinda Ardern. She said the 21 APEC economies have been dealt a heavy burden, but also an opportunity to strike an economic reset on a scale that we haven't seen since World War II. And Ardern zeroed in on 3 key areas where the APEC community can make progress. She talked to digital trade and transformation, inclusive policies that empower Indigenous communities and promote gender equality. And she also talked to sustainable and low carbon policies that support green industry growth. And I think that's highly relevant to our discussion today. And also wanted to note the really interesting Minister of Transport and the portfolio leads in the opposition parties yesterday afternoon, talking very much about how to deliver broader outcomes through the transport infrastructure sector. So we're going to talk on the panel with Monica, Rhyl and Victoria as well. We're going to talk about how the G20 governments are approaching transformative infrastructure. We're going to talk more about international approaches to broader outcomes. And we're going to think about how to translate why into action as we apply social value through infrastructure. So Monica Bennett, I'm going to go to you first, but an intro for you and for Rhyl. Monica's the Director of Thought Leadership at the GI Hub. And the GI Hub has a role to support the G20 governments to drive a really ambitious agenda on sustainable, resilient and inclusive transformative infrastructure. Monica leads the delivery of the GI Hub's strategic and innovation-focused programs of work, including work streams on infratech, infrastructure futures, the circular economy, and transformative recovery post-COVID. She ensures that these programs address emerging trends within the industry and that the resulting knowledge products are developed using strategic and user-centric approaches, with the aim to create impact for the G20 governments and industry stakeholders. So I'll pass to you, Monica, now, and after Monica, I'll introduce you, Rhyl. Over to you, Monica.
Fantastic. Thank you, Juliet. It's wonderful to be part of this panel, so thank you to Jacobs as well for inviting me here today. I'll spend the next 5 minutes taking you through our work on transformative outcomes through infrastructure, which seems to be quite a relevant topic, based on the presentation of Victoria and as well, what you've mentioned about some of the priorities across New Zealand in transport. But, really the idea is for this initiative to encourage the industry to think differently about how infrastructure is being planned, financed, and delivered. Juliet, you've already given a really quick background on the Global Infrastructure Hub, so I'm not going to, I won't repeat what you've said, but I guess we're, the only dedicated infrastructure entity of the G20, and we're a not-for-profit. And our role at the Hub is to be able to produce knowledge products that can help the G20 governments make more informed decisions when it comes to infrastructure policy and infrastructure financing. Really the intended result of our work is to be able to help those governments mobilize more private capital into infrastructure, to help them do more with less, and to use better quality infrastructure to support economic recovery post-COVID. So it's important to point out that our key audience with a lot of the work that we do are, G20 governments, and more specifically, the ministries of finance within those G20 governments. And, when we're talking about infrastructure, we are looking at it from, this sort of macroeconomic global perspective. So starting at, the highest level of impact, which is helping to set that G20 agenda for infrastructure in areas where the G20 can collaborate to create impact at a global level. So why did we embark on this project? And I've put the link in there to our online tool, and later on I can post it online as well for anyone that wants to jump on the tool to check it out. We developed this tool in response to COVID. So governments needed infrastructure for strong economic recovery and growth post-COVID. And we've seen that public investment has a 1.5 times multiplier on GDP growth, which is much more than other types of public spending. But I guess when you have a very rapidly changing landscape as a result of a crisis, such as the pandemic, there was a little bit of, well, actually quite a lot of uncertainty in terms of where governments really needed to invest, their hard-earned money in order to create the best sort of impact for people and planet. So we were asked by the G20 to be able to track infrastructure investment trends in response to COVID, and in particular with an emphasis on what we're calling transformative outcomes through infrastructure. And these are long-term outcomes that are looking beyond economic development, so beyond jobs and beyond GDP growth, to make sure that we're really ensuring the best possible results in terms of sustainable, resilient, and inclusive outcomes. So what did we find through our research? We found that in total across the G20 that around 3.2 trillion was announced since February 2020 from G20 governments into infrastructure as a stimulus. And this is approximately 3% of the G20's GDP. And to give you a little bit of context in terms of how that compares in terms of magnitude to some other numbers, I'll just post a few numbers in here. Back during the GFC, the total stimulus around the world was $2 trillion. So that was around 2% sorry, 1.4% of the GDP. And you can kind of immediately see that, you know, in terms of percentage of GDP, that, you know, the stimulus specifically just in terms of infrastructure, you know, was already more than the total stimulus during the GFC. But also when we compare this figure to what the GI Hub has analyzed as the 2019 annual investment figure for infrastructure investment, which was about 3.7 trillion, you can also see that, you know, this is also quite substantial. And if you assume that that stimulus is going to be spent over the next 2 years, you know, this could represent a 45% increase on annual infrastructure investment figures around the world. And just by way of comparison, if anyone was interested in what the actual total stimulus figure was as of April of this year, that was $17 trillion, which is about 17% of GDP, which is an incredible amount of money. So, you know, in light of the magnitude of government spending at the moment, you know, there has been, you know, quite a lot of trade-offs, obviously, towards spending for the emergency response, which is completely understandable. But, you know, we now need to look at infrastructure as a way to facilitate that strong economic recovery. And so when we break down our stimulus, our 3.2 trillion stimulus figure, this is how it looks in terms of transformative outcomes. We identified 13 transformative outcomes as observed through the infrastructure stimulus packages. And this spans five different categories. So we have environmental sustainability, inclusivity, resilience, digital infrastructure, innovation, and of course, economic development. In collaboration with the G20 economies, we map this stimulus data to transformative outcomes, and these are the trends that you see on the right. And in essence, all stimulus achieves economic development outcomes such as jobs and economic growth. And this is what you can see on the top line there, and you know, that represents 100% of the stimulus that we're seeing at the moment. But you know, what we are advocating for here is that we should be looking beyond economic returns and looking at infrastructure to achieve transformative outcomes. And so what we've seen is that the G20 is investing in transformative outcomes through their stimulus packages. And we've seen that more than 50% of the stimulus that has been announced is linked to these transformative outcomes, which is a very encouraging number and quite a substantial number as well in terms of investment. So if we take this one step further and look at infrastructure to help us achieve long-term transition goals such as the SDGs or net zero, infrastructure investments will obviously have to achieve, you know, at least one transformative outcome. But if we are going to achieve these really aspirational goals, we are very likely needing to achieve multiple transformative outcomes. And I'll give you an example of that later. This is just a quick snapshot of what the trends look like by sector. So you can see that transport and social infrastructure are on top of the list, and they're the two largest sectors at 26% and 19% of total stimulus. And just to compare, you know, a few other figures here, you know, that's the energy sectors. So in aggregate, that's about 12%. And the water sector, and I know there's a fair amount of interest in the audience today in the water sector, is at about 7%. So when we delve a little bit deeper into the largest sector for stimulus, which is the transport sector, we can see how G20 governments are using this to achieve transformative outcomes. And hopefully you can see that properly on the slide. Transport has the potential to address quite a number of transformative outcomes, actually, you know, many of which may not often be considered as part of conventional transport investment. So, you know, part of this is to be able to give people ideas in terms of what can be achieved and the fact that it can actually be achieved as well. So in addition to jobs and growth, you know, the two most popular, you know, transformative outcomes through transport are inclusive mobility and the low carbon transition. And much of this is being done through investments into rail and investments into zero emissions vehicle infrastructure. In fact, the transport sector is the largest sector contributing to the low carbon transition outcomes, actually, which is also a really interesting trend. And I won't go through this in too much detail because we haven't got too much time, but we have this sort of breakdown for each of the sectors. You can do it for other sectors as well, such as water. Some interesting trends there in terms of water and transformative outcomes. But I thought I would go into a few examples of country trends as well. So Victoria mentioned the bipartisan infrastructure deal in the US, which is a very substantial investment when it comes to infrastructure. What I've shown here on the right is the sector ranking. So the US is prioritizing transport through their various stimulus packages. And so this isn't just specifically the bipartisan infrastructure deal, but that deal including several other packages as well. In total, the US has announced around $630 billion worth of infrastructure as a stimulus. And so this is the breakdown in terms of sectors and also how that is targeting transformative outcomes, which is on the right there. What we've done is we've picked out an example of the most transformative package in the US, which is essentially the largest package by value that also targets the most number of transformative outcomes. And in this case, it's a package that is part of the bipartisan deal, and more specifically, the power infrastructure upgrades, which is around $73 billion. And these are focused on investments in energy transmission for renewables, which are targeting digitalization and low carbon outcomes. And again, we can do this for other countries. Indonesia, by comparison, has announced 183 billion. And they're targeting, their most transformative package is in transport in the rail sector at 8.4 billion. And Australia, with their upgrade to the national broadband network at $3.5 billion US. And this is just a quick snapshot of our work. And I know that we'll probably get into questions a little bit later, and keen to answer them and hear some of your feedback.
Awesome. Thanks, Monica. That was great, staying on the international sort of piece and looking at the larger countries' investments. But I'd like to go to you, Rhyl, next, and let me just do a word for you because sure. You've done some amazing things. So Rhyl Jones-McCoy is our Technical Director for Social Value for JPACS for the APAC region. She's a social value leader and a facilitator who brings people together through design thinking workshops on projects in Australia and New Zealand. She challenges teams to think big and create community legacies through infrastructure. She leads projects in assessing public interest, stakeholder impacts, the generation and distribution of social value. And Rhyl works closely with clients and teams to facilitate engaged decision-making, drawing together elements of positive psychology, human-centered design, and social wellbeing approaches so that projects can achieve positive, broader outcomes. So Rhyl, tell us a bit more about your work in the social value space across ANZ.
Thanks, Juliet, and kia ora to everyone. Thank you so much for having me on this panel. I am joining you today from Meanjin, which is the Aboriginal word for Brisbane, Australia, and it is respectfully, I acknowledge that it is the traditional land of the Yagara and Turrbal people. I am joining you today to speak a bit more in depth. The first two speakers, Victoria and Monica, have given a great overview of different aspects of the breadth and the investment of infrastructure, and we can see the opportunity is so great. But when we released the white paper in 2020, we really set a vision for Jacobs to start a conversation much broader and to really bring that conversation into countries like Australia and New Zealand, where we didn't have a social value act like the UK, but New Zealand's broader outcomes policy and strategies are really much more aligned to what was happening in the UK, but we actually also wanted to take our cultural aspects of community and individuality that was different from other countries and bring it more to the Asia Pacific kind of conversation. So we launched this thought paper, and the framework shown on the screen there shows probably our biggest concept, which Victoria alluded to, that one part of it, which was very strong, is that we need to have new types of partnerships. But this picture on the screen really shows how we have found the most important part of thinking about social value is that you need to start earlier than we used to consider that was important. So planning is when you need to start thinking. All those dotted points are showing start thinking earlier, start planning for these. It's not a conversation to start having about social value in the delivery phase. So today I just wanted to speak a bit more about one specific part, but it is linked to all the other parts. We've had a lot of presenters over the last few days. I went back and listened to quite a few of the panels, and there's been some great conversation about social procurement in New Zealand, and there's a lot of great conversation also about blended funding. But I want to speak specifically about co-design and the opportunity of collaborating with partners and also with your community, because it's not just operating within projects, it's actually operating through projects and with others. So in order to respond to climate change and the change and opportunities that we need to create quite quickly to reach 2050 goals for decarbonisation, we all have to work together. It's not going to happen through one project or one company or one location or one country, and it's not even going to happen at one point in time. It's going to take a collaborative, collective effort. So our team has been actually looking at broader outcomes on a number of different projects. So considering these for some of the New Zealand upgrade projects, and also specifically looking at some of the sustainability procurement guidelines from Auckland Transport, and looking at how do you bring all this together with a big bunch of ideas together. So just having a little slide. Oh, I hope the IT. Sorry, my slide is not clicking through. I'll just get someone to fix that for me. So I guess I just want to challenge that sometimes the ideas, they might seem quite small at any given time, but I want to share a couple of ideas from a few different UK projects that we've been trying to bring through to some of our projects. One UK project, they actually got the project team who were working in an area. One of the targets was that people who work on the project were local to the project, but also that people who work with the project lived within 25 miles of the project. And they set that as a very big goal in a highly unemployed area. And they actually tracked that goal for 3 years across the project. And as that came to life, that every person on the project gave 2 hours of volunteering time per month. Now, that's not a lot of time, but when you add that up across a project team across 3 to 5 years, people also were really identified their strengths. So some people gave talks at schools about STEM and STEAM. Some people did artwork, some people did tutoring. But the contribution to the local community and economy through a project existing in a site was enormous and was tracked across all different measures. So one of our most important things in understanding social value is that you need to understand what would success look like? What do you want to deliver in broader outcomes? We have started to use the term mana extra, which is from good to great. So there's lots of great ideas around at the moment, particularly in New Zealand. It's very progressive in terms of driving social procurement. There's lots of ideas about really focusing on Pacifica and Maori businesses and building them up. But how do we take that good concept and make it really great? And one of the best ways we can do that is to actually use co-design. So I'm just, sorry, I'm having a little slide challenge, which is very right. Here I am. So what I really wanted to speak about was collaboration. Value is really created through the share of not just, so collaboration is not about the endpoint. Collaboration is the process as well. So how you collaborate with your partners is vitally important. And I think it's been really great to hear people talk about diversity and inclusion in a really strong leadership way. But to create innovation, you need different voices around the table. I heard, I think Alice Bray from Wakatahi yesterday mentioned that each person has a part to play in a partnership. And I really liked that because no one can take anyone else's voice away. So you need diverse thinking around your table to get much broader outcomes. Some of the keys, I've just got some of the keys on the slide. Actually see community as co-designers when you're partnering, and identify partners of all scales and types on your projects. this is a really important one, and I'll just share. This is a workshop that we ran, and I've only very lightly been involved, but as the introduction mentioned, Juliet is a very high advocate for involving social value on the Eastern Busway Alliance. So we designed a workshop using design thinking. So design thinking is a great tool. I'm sure many people are familiar with it, but it actually takes people on a bit of a journey where you expand thinking, and then so diverge thinking, then converge, so bring it back together to try and solve things, and then you test it, and then you diverge and converge again. So we've been using that kind of model behind some big workshops. So these workshops are very collaborative, using a mural board, and I've just put across the top some of the things that we were starting to brainstorm against major themes. So when you're talking about people being connected to their place, are there catalyst sites or infrastructure that can facilitate that? How do we unlock this? And most importantly here, who are the potential partners that can help us? And for a project like this, there are an enormous amount of people along a busway route or a light rail route who can become collaborative partners. They might be housing providers. They may be a local cafe that can become the site of a social procurement project that can really create high value outcomes. Specific stakeholders, sometimes there's very specific stakeholders that you want to target or who are involved or impacted by a project, and then really understanding what success looks like in a qualitative and quantitative way. My favorite example from this project is actually that a sports oval was a key pillar of catalyst, identified as a catalyst site. And someone mentioned that there was lots of great partnerships and teams and different groups that, you know, it could become a great community asset if it was rebuilt after the project. But my favorite qualitative measure was given in this workshop, where someone said, how good would it be if we had an intimidating home ground that everyone was a bit scared of coming to play at, and that gave us that just punch. And I love that because it actually has really local feel, and it has a really New Zealand feel of rugby, and I just felt like it really captured something about what's the vision. I just also want to share a co-design project with you. So this is from Australia, and this is really specifically about asking people who use your infrastructure. It's not always what you think. We have very accessible ferries, physically accessible ferries in Brisbane, and they were being extended to add a top deck, which was not going to be accessible. So it created an opportunity to speak with people with disabilities. Uh, so we facilitated a very strong human-centered design workshop, which is where we really asked, tell us about your experience. And we actually didn't ask, you know, what would you change? What would you improve? We asked, what's the journey like for you? And this is very important in creating value through transport projects. People who use the bus every day, people who ride the bike path every day, they have a lot to tell us about what could be better, what could be improved, how an outcome could be connected to another part of the journey, and to create higher value. So thinking about co-designing with people who use your infrastructure is really important. In this project, people said, yep, we can get on the ferry, we love it, but we noticed that the people can sit out the back and they have a panoramic sunset view on the beautiful trip up the river. Where we sit in a wheelchair is next to the prams. There's always children crying on it because it's late in the afternoon after work, and we can't see anything except for a guardrail, because that's what's at eye height when you sit in a wheelchair. And that obviously is not equality of access to the same amenity just because you're sitting in a wheelchair. So that was really eye-opening to us in terms of listening, and then actually saying, what would you design? And, you know, some of the outcomes were from a 4-hour workshop. This is not a major investment. It's actually about, but the process and the respect in the process is a really fundamental part of what we were trying to achieve. What's happened with that, there's a shared ownership of ideas, and also this became a prototype. There's since been 9 ferries built using this new prototype design, which has high accessibility in lots of different ways, but also increases amenity. So I will stop there. Thank you. And just want to say thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today. I love working in New Zealand. I love the energy that New Zealanders bring to collaborating and to sharing. And I would really encourage you that if that hasn't been a tool that you've been using, to actually think about speaking with your partners and speaking with your infrastructure users much earlier in your projects to help shape your designs. Thanks, Juliet.
Awesome. So we've covered, at quite a range of levels, the thinking around broader outcomes. I'm going to go to you, Victoria, and bring you back into the conversation. I'll try and get one question to each of you. We did have quite a, I think it got 6 likes, a question on best ways to collaborate. Rhyl, I think you've just covered that. So I'm going to go straight to the top question for you, Victoria. How has broader outcomes positively impacted delivery of large infrastructure programs in the States? From a grassroots perspective, is this impacting communities to increase capability, capacity, and building a legacy? Over to you, Victoria.
Yes, absolutely, and fantastic question. So it certainly is delivering real outcomes in terms of, I'll give a few examples. So as I mentioned, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, as we prioritize redeveloping our airports, the investment at LaGuardia, JFK, and EWR airports is tremendous. That's over $20 billion of investment, and local citizens are benefiting from that investment through job training. There's over 140 local providers in terms of community-based organizations, educational centers, and the like, who are providing training services to individuals that live in New York City. So they're benefiting not only through training, but their soft skills, life skills, and of course, at the end of that, there's employment on the program. I'd also like to highlight, as Ian mentioned, the California high-speed rail project that is ongoing here in the States. And as that emerges, there's also, of course, a tremendous social impact of that with regards to a high-speed train, that will go from through the Central Valley to Southern California, and essentially looking at all of the different communities and jurisdictions and geographies that we impact, and also ensuring workforce development, job training, as well as jobs. So that's just a quick example. And lastly, I'll end. Green infrastructure and the arts is also another way that we're ensuring integrated project delivery through programs across all sectors. Specifically in the water space, we are seeing a variety of utilities, as I showed on that map of 25 cities and counting, really investing in the community through green infrastructure to tackle, of course, some of our climate change challenges and resilience, but also working in partnership with the local community, at-risk youth, young people, Black and Brown communities, Indigenous communities, First Nations communities, essentially to ensure that they're also partnering with that investment. So they're developing their training skills and new skills that they can either keep with them in their career in the infrastructure, have new skills and decide to go to another sector. But essentially, in terms of economic inclusion, community well-being, we are definitely seeing increased collaboration and benefit through infrastructure projects in a way that local communities are benefiting. Juliet?
Awesome, thanks, Victoria. That was a good answer. I'm going to go to you, Monica Bennett, to draw you in. The question is in a different area, and it's around data transparency. Now I've lost it. Okay. To what extent is transparency about data needed to agree broader outcomes and to measure progress towards them?
Really great question, and actually a really big focus of us here at the Hub. To be able to make good decisions, you need good data. And when it comes to public investment into infrastructure, that data is not readily available. And I guess there's a reason for that. One is that especially when you look at a global level, it's quite difficult to extract the data from budgets when it comes to infrastructure across each of the countries. There's not just a language barrier, there's also the fact that for a lot of countries, infrastructure investment is coming at the subnational level and maybe even at the local city level as well. And so it's hard to be able to track all of that in like a very feasible way that comes in a timely manner. So, and so I guess we need to look at it from a pragmatic perspective. And, transparency in the context of the work that we've done in terms of stimulus was to be able to, and actually, before I get into that, I should probably say that stimulus is not actual spending. And so it's sort of an announcement of planned investment into infrastructure, and we will expect to see that be converted into budgets over the period of 2 to 3 years. But really the reason why we looked at stimulus was to provide transparency in terms of how some of these new trends are emerging in terms of infrastructure. So in a post-COVID world, if you have to make decisions quickly, you can't wait 3 years for data on budgets to come through to understand how governments are looking to invest. And so that transparency was really critical in this respect, to show where governments are going and where potentially we need to be directing our efforts as well. Was there a second part to that question?
No, but I might just see if Ryl's got anything to add about transparency of data in terms of the measurement of broader outcomes. Any perspective on that?
I think that's part of the of setting the goals and understanding what kind of measures are you going to use and what kind of data sets that you can access early on. I think that's part of collaboration, actually, and there's often data sets that we can't all access that are in different government departments that are quite hard to access, but to actually get a broader outcome, there needs to be some synergy and sharing across for the higher good, I think. But that's definitely part of the project design, I think, in terms of intention to create broader outcomes.
Good, thanks. I've got quite a few questions queued up here. So I might direct this to Rhyl in the first instance, and it's about a topic that we've heard a lot about over the last 4 days. We've heard a lot this week about 2 city shaping projects for Auckland, being the Auckland Light Rail and the Waitemata Harbour Crossing. These are both hugely city shaping projects. What potential do you think these projects have for social outcomes? And do you have any case studies or examples?
Yes, great question. I have worked on the Gold Coast Light Rail, actually, and it's in stage 5 now. And I've worked on many of those stages, and I'm currently on that project on the Queensland's Gold Coast. That's a light rail that goes alongside near the beach through many different types of communities. So have lots of learnings from that. I guess adding local infrastructure is a huge catalyst in terms of local transport that people can see, and that's regular and consistent. So the mix between the bus and the light rail just creates something quite different in terms of mode shift. So the uptake at every single stage of the Gold Coast Light Rail has exceeded expectations and projections in terms of mode shift. And a whole heap of people who thought they may not use it, and all the survey data is quite interesting. So it's that's a really exciting part, that light rail offers a mode shift which is somewhere between those 2 forms of transport. The other learnings, I think our collaboration is getting more interesting as we learn more along that project. And one thing that we've been talking about in this next stage is some of the naming and really honouring some of the traditional names of places, but also collaborating with art and creating community reflective places. So there's lots of rail stops. That's a very simple thing to do, but how you collaborate and who you engage to do that can have quite great outcomes. And I think the other thing we've actually seen along the light rail is to see spaces between as part of the journey, but actually to understand that the light rail creates a series of connected communities. And that's a very different way to view transport infrastructure going through something. So honouring what the community, each of those communities are, and working to maintain that sense of place with people in those communities. So that's probably some of the big learnings that I can share off the top of my head. And I'm sure that would be really great for Auckland Light Rail to be looking to some of the learnings from the other light rail projects too.
Thanks, Rhyl. Great answer. So I might go back to you, Victoria. I'm trying to be fair about my share of the questions here. So this question says, thanks for these useful insights. And it's a question around capability versus diversity. Capability should come before diversity for the sake of it. Do you have an opinion on the positions such as this? So it's, how do we address capability versus diversity for the sake of it? Over to you, Victoria.
Sure, no, absolutely. Excellent question. So absolutely, capability, skill set, and thought leadership within any sector is certainly paramount and priority. It's top of mind. I'd like to frame that very similar to conversations we have about gender equity and gender equality, in terms of, then in the infrastructure sector, we do work in a male-dominated industry. But we do have male allies, for example, in terms of acknowledging that, but also wanting to be proactive about being inclusive in terms of having women with capabilities, with having skill set, and also women in leadership, as our illustrious panel here is demonstrating. And diversity do work hand in hand. When we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, certainly don't want to diminish the capabilities aspect whatsoever. But in terms of, again, some of the discriminatory practices, systemic policies, et cetera, we're intentional about excluding people based upon race, gender, et cetera. So if we want to correct that, we certainly want to keep capabilities top of mind, but in the same way that we are very proactive about being inclusive about women, just for an example, in terms of ensuring that women's issues and voices are heard, we also have to provide that same level of effort and action and intentional action around race, income levels, education levels, sexual orientation, and the like.
Thank you. Awesome work, panelists. Now I'm going to put you on the spot, Rhyl, because you offered a poem, and I think that would be lovely for the audience. And then I'll do my close and hand back to Ian. Have you got your poem ready to go there, Rhyl?
I have. And it might be unusual to bring a poem to this, but I guess there's a lot of conversation about STEM, and we often like to add the A and bring the arts to it. And Mary Oliver is an American poet, and I was thinking about collaboration about our sustainable future, and I read this and thought it would be great. I would say that there exists 1,000 unbreakable links between each of us and everything else, and that our dignity and our chances are one. The farthest star and the mud at our feet are a family, and there is no decency or sense in honouring one thing or a few things and then closing the list. The pine tree, the leopard, the Platte River, and ourselves, we are at risk together, or we are on our way to a sustainable world together. We are each other's destiny. Thank you.
Oh, that was lovely. Awesome way to finish on the social piece. I love it. Maybe we'll get you to share the poem and the discussion for the audience.
Absolutely, I can do that.
So I just want to thank you, Victoria, in particular, for joining us from the US, and also wonderful panelists, Monica and Rhyl. It's so great to be connected to you in this really important discussion for New Zealand. We've heard from all of you about the power of infrastructure to transform our future. We've heard from the US and Australia and the G20 governments around the world. They're all signalling this strong commitment to broader outcomes, and we've got so much to learn and share on this journey. Jacobs have got 2 white papers coming, and the first one's been released, and it's called Beyond Carbon, and the tagline is, what if city stakeholders used a programmatic approach, looking beyond traditional project boundaries to co-develop solutions that reduce carbon and address the most urgent and aspirational needs of the community. So I'm going to post the link to that white paper. It's brilliant, and I suggest you have a look at that. We've heard that through infrastructure, we have an opportunity to make a huge social impact, and there's a twofold benefit to this. So with this historic investment in the US of $1 trillion, just announced the bipartisan agreement, fantastic, Victoria, great work, and the historic infrastructure investments across the G20 and also in New Zealand, we can support well-being through a productive, sustainable and carbon neutral economy, and in doing so, improve the lives and address our vulnerable communities. So thank you to all of you, and I'll pass back to Ian. Thanks.
Thanks, Juliet. On behalf of the Infrastructure New Zealand Board, I'd like to say thanks to Jacobs, who have sponsored today's important session.